Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the China Manufacturing Decoded podcast. And today is a treat. Today we have two guests, two experts on a slightly complicated topic. And the topic of today is how to work with a key supplier and get them to move to zero defect, or let's say to move closer and closer and closer to zero defect. So today I have with me, like in two previous episodes, not too long ago, Clive Greenwood. Hi, Clive. How are you doing?
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Great. So nice to see you back here. And to make it a little bit of an exchange of views, we also invited Max Phythian from China Manufacturing Consultants. Actually, he's based in the Middle East these days, doing some work over there, but he's also worked for many years in China. Hello, Max. How are you doing?
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Very well, thank you.
Great.
Morning, Clive.
So I think it should be pretty interesting because Clive comes from a background of Six Sigma black belt, has been working in manufacturing in different roles. Max comes with long experience at Toyota, so what people would call original or pure lean, the pure lean approach, right? Max has also been doing a lot of consulting after that for various organizations. So let's go straight into the topic. Let's say I work for a relatively large company. I have some weight over my suppliers, at least my key suppliers. And what does it actually take to get a key supplier to decide to go close to zero defect and to actually do it? Maybe we can start. Maybe let's start with Max. What would you say? What does it take to get that key supplier moving and actually make progress in that direction?
Okay, well, I would say one of the first things from my experience is recognizing what the feedback loop is from the actual manufacturing company. So from the main company, how do they actually feed back to the supplier, and how is that actual feedback recognized? Because if it's just simply an email or some sort of document that's sent back but no action is taken, then effectively you'll just continue on with the same problems over and over again. So I think it's pushing back through the process, but ensuring that something actually is done, some action is taken on the defects, and clear understanding of what the defect is as well, and what the effect it has on the supply chain.
Right. So it's giving structured feedback. That's what you're saying, and feedback that pushes for action. Also, at the same time, making sure that the quality standard is very, very clear. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, you keep talking about, is this a defect? Is this acceptable or not? Rather than talking about what can be done to avoid that. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because I mean, I've worked in a lot of factories where, a part comes in from a supplier and it may be defected. And a lot of the time, the operator or the division doesn't actually know what to do with that part. All they know is that they can't keep their production line going with that particular component. So a lot of the time it's just put to one side. So what effect is that having on the manufacturing company? And like I say, how is that feedback fed back to the supplier? You're right in what you say there, Renaud, in understanding what a defect is and clear understanding. But if the supplier is not made fully aware of why it's classed as a defect, then they may not even realize that they're producing a part that is actually giving a problem to their supplier. So many times you go into into factories as a consultant, and in the warehouse there's a reject parts pile or a quarantine area, etc., and purely because people don't in the manufacturing side, they don't actually know what to do with these defect parts because there's no one controlling the supply chain.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So the key is making sure that they understand what is good, what is not good. They understand the impact that it has on the buyer, on the buying organization, and all the costs that it creates. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Clive, what do you share this view? Do you have something
yeah,
to add on this
100%.
topic?
Yeah, 100%. For me, the big question that I always say to my clients when I go and see it is, how does your supplier view your relationship? Is this a manufacturing partnership, or is this a manufacturing supplier? Because either which way will decide on what actions you can and cannot take. If they are what I would call a true partner, they themselves are giving you feedback without you actually asking for it, and your demands or your requirements do fall in line with what their thoughts are themselves. They want to get better supply because they know that by getting better supply, by having much more consistent quality, the chances are that you will order more business from them. And a true partner will be demanding as well that you are helping them to raise their quality standards by being demanding. And a good partner for me will be one that constantly pushes you to improve as well. So it can't just be a one-way street. And Max is absolutely right, 100%. I mean, I've been to factories and there are not just piles, but roomfuls of reject products, and no one knows what it's all about. It's got to be the synergy between the supplier, the client, how they view their relationship, and how their interdepartments work with each other. It can't be a single person contact. It has to be, the quality manager from the supplier talking to the quality manager of the client in an open, free, transparent way. That's really the only way that I see. What do you think, Max?
No, 100%, absolutely. And the point that you've made there about, rooms full of parts that nobody knows what to do to, that's a very key point. Now, I would say that the point that you've made there about the partnership, that's absolutely important, because if the supplier is just simply making parts and getting paid for it and shipping them out the door with no relationship upstream, then they'll just keep shipping them because they're just getting paid. So for them, it doesn't matter, because if their attitude is, so long as we're getting paid, everything's okay. But going back to one of my points is, if they believe that it's okay, then you can't necessarily blame the supplier, because if there's no feedback loop, if there's no feedback loop going back to say this is a problem and causing us a problem, then actually you can't blame them. You can't turn around and, say, oh, they're a terrible supplier because the parts are always, damaged or this or that. Well, unless you tell them and you're very clear on how those parts need to be accepted into or shipped from their factory, then, so that feedback loop is absolutely imperative. And then that creates then the partnership that Clive's mentioned there. Yeah.
So what both of you are saying is that the buyer has a huge role actually to fill, to make sure the quality standard is very clear, to communicate that, and to give regular feedback to the supplier on what they're receiving, or maybe if they're doing inspection, make it very, very clear why this or that is defective, right? And also in creating the conditions for that kind of supplier-buyer partnership, because I've seen a number of times, and I'm sure you have too, cases where maybe the purchasers get involved and the purchasers keep beating the supplier for savings, and then everybody at the supplier is like closing and there's one key person who's deflecting the demands from purchasing, and then you go into that, and it's actually very transactional. It's exactly the opposite of what Clive was describing. Does that make sense? Have you seen these kinds of situations?
I've lost count.
Yes. Right.
I mean, again, the whole thing as well is what I found, and as you know, I mean, I've worked with some very largish companies, and the problem is, and this is really across multiple industries, but the buyer actually does not know what is acceptable quality limits are.
No.
So you can't blame a supplier if you don't tell him.
Right. Yeah. Here's a spec, and if things are a little bit different, but we think it looks fine and it works fine, then no problem. And what does the supplier do with that? Yes, absolutely, yes.
You can't blame him for that. I mean, when I go and do an inspection, I will say, can you give me a copy of all the paperwork that you've sent to this guy? And if there isn't a detailed AQL on there, I don't know what I'm inspecting. So he can't know what he's supposed to be making because the buyer doesn't know what he's trying to buy. Correct. I mean, that is a recipe which I see on a daily basis.
Right.
Now, yeah, I mean, I'm involved, as you know, with some pretty advanced medical devices, and I'm actually writing the entire system, so that the idea of partnerships with buyers and sellers, the engineering departments talk to the engineering department, the quality department talks to the quality department, and everything is laid out transparently. Yes, it's in forms, it has to be in forms, so that when the product comes into the factory, not only are the goods inspection people knowing what they're inspecting, but the guys that have sent it know everything about the product itself. Now, there is obviously a lot of trust that needs to be built up there. But if the guys that are making, certainly critical to quality components, if they know the product, the chances are that they will be able to even spot defects in the actual, probably in the design or even the drawing, and give the engineers some feedback and stop the thing from becoming a disaster before it even becomes an issue. That's what I'm talking about, partnerships, not just on, shaky handy, let's go for a drink type thing. Where, I mean, I worked for a long time with a very large Chinese telecoms manufacturer, and I had an office in their building so that I could easily just pop up to the engineering department and say, what about this? That's what I'm talking about. It's the more complex the component or the more complex the assembly, the more interaction there needs to be. That's what I'm saying. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. So taking on from Clive's point there. Yes, I agree with what Clive's saying. I mean, the partnership is the total relationship. I think when you start talking about the different departments, so if you just take three key departments, for example, so you've got production, engineering, and procurement. So obviously production need to deal with the components when they come in. Engineering might be part of the specification side of it, and procurement obviously on the buying side of it. So unless those three within the organization, within the factory, have got clear communication amongst themselves, then you can, I do find a lot of the time that suppliers are blamed for a lot of, let's say, defect parts or parts that aren't to specification. But I think, as Clive said earlier on as well, unless it's very, very clear as to what the specification is, and has it been confirmed, has it been checked, and the feedback within the company from production to engineering, from engineering to procurement, because as we all know, procurement like to, in their view, save money. They all like to. That's part of their job. That's part of their role. but saving money can have massive detrimental effects. I've seen where a component can be specified by engineering, procurement can go out and source the parts, source the supplier. But one key thing that they tend to miss is how those parts are packaged. Are they batched? How they're actually transported? What are the logistics? Because I've seen a lot of time where components are fine when they leave the factory, but because of cheap packaging, cheap logistics, or whatever that is, actually when they arrive at the manufacturing process, the parts are actually damaged, or they're in batches that then need to be sifted and sorted. All kinds of problems. So there's the whole supply chain, but it's both internally, the feedback internally, and then ultimately the feedback outside to the supplier. And then the key one there is who is actually, who is the key point of contact between the manufacturing, the client, if you like, and the supplier. How is that feedback? Is that feedback through engineering? Is it through quality? Is it through procurement? Who is actually controlling? And I think that's one thing within the within the client side, the manufacturing side, that they need to have the clear process as to how that works.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can give you an example from my experience in Toyota. I worked a lot of my time in Toyota in body assembly and press parts, etc. And we had a lot of components that small pressed parts that were pressed by external suppliers, and they would come in. And let's just say, for example, we've got a small component, pressed part the size of your hand, and it's got various tabs on it, etc. And maybe a tab's damaged, which means that it then has to be straightened before it can be put into a jig or something like this. So we may get a batch of them that comes in. So, okay, our main focus is to keep production running. So we would put an extra person on that, bending all the tabs to the correct orientation so they can be loaded into the machine. But what we would immediately do in Toyota is we would inform the supplier, and to get the supplier, if you like, to feel a little bit of the pain, we would demand that they sent someone to our site to sift through all the parts and to straighten, let's just say there's a bent tab on it. So to straighten all the bent tabs, so the supplier are directly involved and they know, so their organization, their business knows that they've had to send a person out there. Why have we had to send a person? Because we've got a problem with a part. So it's without actually doing any communication, if you like, directly to the senior management of the supplier or whatever. They all know about it. They're all very, very aware of it because they've had to put a man in a van and send him out to a factory.
Right. This is great advice. Making sure that communication flows the right way to the right people in the supplier's organization. What about communication to top management? So you have a supplier. You think, okay, they are a key supplier. We've already been working on making it sort of a partnership, a little bit less transactional, one-off kind of purchases, but more long-term, more as a partnership. And then you really want them to, and let's say they produce, 1% of defectives, which in a lot of industries is not unheard of, right? It's not great, but it's not even considered horrible. So it just depends on their competitors, right? But then let's say your company decides, okay, we have to get this supplier to move to zero defect. So you need to talk to top management, right? So how to approach that, basically? Maybe Clive, do you have some suggestions?
Yeah, one word: inclusion.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's assume that we're looking at a new component or a new part, a new subassembly. Early inclusion is vital, and for that, I've taken a book actually, Max, from Toyota's. Do a lot of things from Toyota actually, but let's say that an obeyer room, for projects is in any manufacturer the first thing that I would put in there, because that is an open route for communication, and probably the best I've ever seen. It lays everything out. There is nothing hidden, and it encourages people to speak up.
So just to make sure people who are listening or watching understand. So an Obeya room is like a war room, right? It's an area where the project team, let's say, or top management or whoever can go in and actually see laid out maybe on the walls the key indicators, the trends, the information collected. Everything is sort of available there, and people meet there regularly, maybe with stand-up meetings or whatever they think makes sense, and actually review this and review the progress on the initiatives. Did I get the description right?
Well, yeah. Basically, an Obeya session or Obeya room, you have outlined the reason or the objectives of the meeting, so everything people can prepare for this. The information, warts and all, is there. I mean, corrective actions are great to put on an Obeya wall, both open and closed. And you get people, I mean, I always say the Obeya room has no chairs. It has a round desk, stand-up desk in the middle, a coffee machine at the side, a projector, and a whiteboard. And the idea is to get down to details, and you keep that to a minimum, to a maximum of 1 hour. So you don't let people waffle on and things like this. Get to the point, open communications, effectiveness. And yes, if it is a component or a new project, then bring in your key suppliers to one of those meetings right at the start. That would be my advice.
Max, what do you think? Have you seen this working well?
I mean, from I mean, we can call it different words: visualization room, war room. Ultimately, it's based on the 3 minute management. You know, being able to understand everything that is going on without speaking to anyone within 3 minutes. But on saying that, I mean, I've seen it, and I've seen various methods using suppliers and bringing them into some visualization centers. I mean, on Clive's point there, total transparency, yes, of course. You know, for me, it's an absolute key foundation point that every business from top to bottom, okay, certain things would be not be transparent, but, you know, transparency across the production, the quality, you know, everything like that should be there. As far as suppliers are concerned, I mean, I have done various visualization rooms where we've set up a supplier board, which then can measure various suppliers against each other, and that can have a strong effect, because if you're measuring parts returned or no good parts, or whichever way you want to cut a graph of or KPI of whichever way you want, but when you've got sort of, say, 5 or 6 suppliers on one board, where you're getting an element of peer pressure there, and certainly when you're working with large companies where these suppliers know that you are, you know, you've got a research and development center, you're constantly, you know, making new products. If you're working in the auto industry, we know that there's facelifts every couple of years, there's new model changes every 5 years. So from a key supplier into some of the industries where the goods are changing and moving, then it's in their own interest to be one of the higher suppliers. You know, and so putting that peer pressure on. And, you know, okay, so some people don't like the idea of the transparency side and that, but at the end of the day, it's open and honest about the business and how it's running, and we're all going in the same direction to improve.
Yes. And to me, any business that I'm talking to that doesn't want to be open and transparent, I question whether or not really we should be dealing with them. Yeah. Because
the first question would be is why?
Yeah. Well, yeah. First question is why? Yeah. What are you trying to hide? And there is a lot of that, an awful lot of that. But I mean, you know, I think in a nutshell, to answer your first question there, Renaud, it is got to be down to communication. If you are not communicating your desires or your requirements, you cannot expect a supplier to actually reciprocate by providing something that he doesn't know.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
An interesting point that you said there, Renaud. But if you start to put it into some form of context of figures, now we all know that you can, companies can supply components worth $1 or $1,000, of course, depending on the complexity, whether it's a sub-assembly or whether it's just a small washer, all the way up to a sub-assembly of a gearbox or whatever.
Mm.
But if you actually put it into context there, what you've said, if it's 1%, and it's $500 per component, and I'm making 100 assemblies a day, then that's $500 per day. That's 1%. So that's $500 off your bottom line. If you don't do something about it and, get back to the supplier and through the procurement department, and set up the correct contracts so that returns goods are paid for, or how that's all negotiated, then that's an awful lot of money off your bottom line.
Well, plus usually it's not just the cost of the parts, right? These parts have been
it's all the administration, etc., etc.
Right. It needs to be sorted out.
The potential loss of business as well. I mean, I went to a company a year and a half ago, and basically they were trying to recruit me as an operations director. And I got there and I said, okay, what's your defective parts per million rate? And I got the, 1%. And we think that that's really good. And I said, really? And I just did a quick calculation in my head and I said, 1% of what I think you're making, looking at your production lines, I think you're actually wasting probably about £500,000 a year. Hmm. What? Impossible. I said, well, here's the math. I said, 1% is not acceptable. It's 0.001%. Yes. 1% on a $24 piece of equipment is not very good. In fact, it's very, very poor. Right.
So both of you touched on an important point here. Yeah, the cost of quality. So usually when customers say, hey, you need to improve quality, here's how it impacts us, then the typical approach, and I've seen that a lot in China, but not just in China, of the, let's say, not very, very sophisticated manufacturing supplier, is to say, well, if you want better quality, I need to put more inspection in. I would have more rework to do. I would have to scrap more material and reprocess more material and everything. All of this will come at an extra cost. And I'm sure you've heard that, 500 times.
And I've never accepted it.
Right. So how do you actually explain to them that this is really maybe totally the wrong way to think?
Change of mindset is an important part of this, to be honest with you. I don't know. I mean, Max, changing people's mindset of the cost of quality. I assume it to this, that the total cost of quality is based on the fact that poor quality always results in bankruptcy.
Well, I suppose ultimately, yes, it can do. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's the truth.
Obviously, obviously, it depends on what the business is and what they're manufacturing. But Clive's 100% correct there. We all work in different manufacturing, and we've all got an extensive background in different companies. I've worked in the automotive, the aero industry, where quality failures can result in loss of life. So there is that extreme, if you like. Going the other side and not sort of going into the depths of that. I think, as you've said there about mindset change, of course, it's not easy, and I wouldn't suggest that it is easy to make people think differently. But I think that if you, as the likes of the consultants that we are and that we work with, to be able to actually start to gather some information and start to put some costings against it. And I think as something that you've touched on there, Renaud, when I spoke about, one part being potentially worth $500, just as an example, but the cost and the impact to the disruption, the business, et cetera, can be a lot more. So if we start to dig into that, because let's just suggest that, I'll just give an example, a gearbox for a car. So a gearbox for a car, if that defect isn't recognized when it comes into the stores and it's actually built into the finished product, then the cost is then not the cost of the component that we bought. The cost is then an assembled vehicle that would need to be stripped down and components changed on it, et cetera. So the cost then is, well, absolutely. That's a very good point, that, Clive. I've worked in the automotive industry for various companies, Mercedes, BMW, Jaguar, etc. And if you get a recall, then, we see it in the press sometimes where, a defect has been recognized and the recalls brought in for a whole period of vehicles or something like this that was bought over a period of time, take it back to the garage. Cost is immense.
Well, one thing on that one you've got to look at is just what's happened to VW.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
with the emissions,
falsifying documentation, and we see that a lot. You see, the whole point of this really is that not only is we're talking about defects in products, on the field that I work in, defects in documentation and test reports and things like this is basically endemic. And the knock-on effect now, certainly under EU MDR, is, well, you can be prosecuted not just for the product failure, but also a documentation failure as well. And so this is something that, is something that needs to be, again, it is this change of, do we do it cheap and rough, or do we do it good and right?
Right. So EU MDR, for people who might not know, is the medical device regulation that came into effect recently in Europe for medical devices, and that is much stricter than what was there before. Yeah. So fake documents are considered a pretty serious issue, rightfully so. But that you both of you touched on an interesting point here. So medical devices, auto, aerospace, yes. It can cause loss of life if some products, if a lot of products are defective, even one product is defective, can cause loss of life. So is this why, let's say in the auto industry in the 80s, there were a lot of changes, right? Before that, quality was, especially I'm talking North America and in Europe, it was not that great. And since the 80s, there has been a lot of improvement. Has this been driven by a no tolerance, very strong stance kind of approach by the car makers? What caused the change here? Or is it just a lot of communication with the suppliers, and over time they got it, they understood the cost of quality, they understood all of that, and on their own, because the incentives were there, they improved quality? What exactly drove that? Maybe
regulations.
Relations? Primarily
regulations.
Oh, regulations. Yes.
Regulations. Yeah, it was actually customer driven.
Right. Okay. So if it's regulations, if it's compliance, it just has to get done, and defectives are just not acceptable. Period. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's my view. Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose there's also an element of results driven, let's say. Just take something as simple. I mean, I think we've gone off slightly, but I mean, wearing a seatbelt. Wearing a seatbelt back in the 70s and 80s wasn't even considered necessary to do that. So obviously, as results were showing that wearing a seatbelt saves lives, then that drives the quality into and the different techniques within manufacturing of seatbelts. From the old style of non-recoil ones to the recoil ones to ones that you get on your top end cars, which come and almost put it on for you. But I'm not sure that whether that's quality driven or, as Clive said, more sort of like from a legislation side.
Interesting. So because a lot of people are not in a highly regulated industry, right? They're not in auto, in aerospace. Right. Actually, even in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, a lot of people are still struggling with that. Now, imagine people in general consumer goods. So how should they approach that with their suppliers? So again, it's going to be a lot of communication with middle management, communication directly to the right people, a lot of feedback, a lot of teaching, a lot of clarifications, and really being as transparent and inclusive as possible. But what if you really want to go fast? Like some companies, some groups say, okay, this is our new policy. We need to go in that direction. It's got to be, a sharp decrease in defects, because maybe we're moving up market, maybe we have some competition and we're really losing a lot of market share because our quality is not that great. How can they accelerate the curve a little bit, rather than keep giving feedback and trying to be inclusive and talking about key suppliers, key partnerships, things like that. And over time it will work, but how many years is it going to take? Who knows? Especially if at the same time there's also a lot of price pressure, and then the purchasers getting involved and everything we talked about before that can derail that idea of a partnership. How can they jumpstart it? Have you got any ideas?
I'll let you go on that one, Max.
Well, I think that's it's a difficult question, because it's where somebody wants to pitch themselves within the market. So yeah. If when you talk about consumer goods, for example, let's take an example, a washing machine. So if there's a company that's quite happy to make lots of them at a lower cost, and they don't mind about, or they don't care about particularly about their brand name or whatever, because they can produce it at such a low cost that they know people will buy it because it's an affordable item. So it's $200 instead of your standard at $400. If that's where somebody wants to pitch themselves within the market, I think you're in a very difficult situation to try to improve their quality. But on saying that, it doesn't mean to say that they can't make the product for less cost themselves and make even more money. So there's another angle there, because if they're exactly the same as we spoke about before, if they are getting cheaper parts, let's say, from their suppliers, but if they're contracted, if the contract is written correctly by procurement, that, you deliver 100 parts every day and they should be of this standard, and we won't accept any defects. If in the contract it says we'll accept 1% defect and we'll send it back to you, and you send us a new one back that's not defected. So it all comes down to where you want to pitch yourself within that. But I mean, interesting though, there's a client that's just approached me, and they make a particular consumer goods similar to what I've just mentioned there, and they've actually come and said to me, we want to be the same as some of the high-end Italian brands. So that's where they are now pitching themselves. They've said, we want to be recognized as higher quality. How can we go about that? Now that's fantastic for them, because obviously open to ideas, because that's where they want to be and that's where they want to pitch themselves. So coming up with ideas for them is not going to be easy, but obviously they're going to be more open-minded to what those suggestions are, because that's their end goal. So I think it depends on where the manufacturer sits within that market and what they want to, how they want to operate. But recognizing the cost of what it is another item, because I mean, I've never been involved in it, but I mean, if you buy the cheap washing machine and it breaks down after 6 months, how does that cost actually come back to the original manufacturer? Because you send it back, a repair person comes out. Is there any actual link between the manufacturer and the service cost or the warranty costs? How is that link sort of joined together at the bottom line to make the manufacturing people recognize that actually, you know, we may be able to put some KPI out to say we've made 100,000 washing machines this year, and you know, we make $100 profit on every machine, therefore this is the maths, this is what we've made. But actually, is it ever incorporated that, you know, 10% of those were returned, as a serviceman had to go out to repair them because they were failed within the warranty period? There was also insurance claims, etc. How are those two linked together?
Absolutely, yes. And with home appliances, it can be very, very, very expensive. I read recently, GE in the 80s had costs on their fridges of something like $400 or $500 million because of, you know, poor one part that needed to be changed, and then it was still defective and you need to go back and things like that. Costs just balloon like crazy. So let me rephrase the question. You made some great points. Let me rephrase the question a little bit. Actually, it's going to be our the last question for both of you. Let's say the context is a little bit different. Let's say you have a major supplier and their quality is just not good, and you've been consistently telling them, we want you to be there, but you are there, and inconsistent. It's even worse, right? And over the years, you keep, you know, complaining about it to them. I mean, they know very clearly your standard, and they know clearly they're way above your standard, but they just don't make, they just don't do anything about it, right? For years and years and years. How, you know, I've seen different things happen. You know, sometimes the buyer just gets really upset, gets another source, tell this guy, the bad guy, okay, you know, you have 3 months to show me some improvement, otherwise I cut your orders by 20% every month, something like that, right? Have you seen these kinds of threats, let's say, or let's say that there might be a stick, but there might also be a carrot, right? In that context, how would you approach it? Would you just say, okay, just source another guy, make sure he's good, and just switch to this guy? Or have you seen actually some people effectively jump starting, okay, the current supplier, put a fire under them, and then they get moving with results? Well,
well, I mean, just if I quick one may go back to what Max was saying before I answer that one.
Sure.
Right. Let's assume that you're requiring a cost reduction. Okay. Now, okay, it depends where you are on the product life cycle. There's nothing wrong. In fact, I would say it's good practice to build in stage cost reduction throughout a product life cycle, and be totally honest with the supplier. Look, this is where it will be. We will accept X amount of cost reduction over a planned period. Then they can actually then look at ways of actually reducing costs and at the same time not impacting on quality. So if you're at the early market entry stage with the product, then having the discussion on a planned cost reduction, it allows people to build in the idea of, well, we're going to be working on this project for a long time. So yes, we can give them an example of at you know, Q1, Y2, it's going to be this. Q3, Y3 is going to be this. That is the type of transparency that I was talking about. As regards to how do you jumpstart them? In some cases, you just have to hold your hands up and realize that they're just never going to get there. It really depends on if you've been talking to them for 2 or 3 years and you're still dealing with the same things. You've got to have to realize that, unfortunately, these guys are not for you. No matter what you've done, no matter how you've tried, you've given them this length of time, they haven't improved, then you have to get rid of them. That simple. For me, I mean, Max, what would you do? I know me.
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's only so many things that you can do to support a supplier. But I mean, going back to one of the earlier points that Clive made about formulating a partnership with your suppliers. I mean, to me, that is, one of the most important points. If you treat a supplier as just a supplier that's going to give me that product, that's what we paid for and that's what we get, then I would say that you're setting yourself up to fail.
Yeah.
As I say, going back to Clive's point, it needs to be a relationship. Their business is as important to them as your business is important to yourself. They shouldn't be treated as a downstream, oh, they're just a supplier. No, they're running a business. They are running a business, and you are, receiving goods from them. So certainly with a number of companies that I've worked with, where we've come to that problem, is set up a supplier development program, so you can actually go into the suppliers and offer support to help them become a good supplier at the right quality, in the right batch numbers, with the right packaging, the right shipments, just in time, Kanbans, whatever processes you want to put in that is going to save you money, then going in and doing the supplier development program. Because when, just as a finishing point, when Toyota first started out in the UK in 1992, they had no suppliers, of course. So a lot of the components originally came over from Japan, because that's where the supply chain was coming from, which obviously huge expense. But slowly but surely, local suppliers were brought in, etc., etc. But Toyota spent an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time on supplier development by going into the companies, because effectively those suppliers had to take on a lot of the philosophies that Toyota had. Now, I'm not suggesting every company out there should follow the Toyota philosophies. What I'm saying is that Toyota aligned the suppliers with what their requirements were. So it doesn't matter what your supplier is, if they're aligned to what you require, whether that's quality, just in time, packaging, batch numbers, delivery, whatever those are, it's about that partnership and developing them to become part of the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Love it. Well, on these wide words, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. So I want to thank my two guests. So Max Phythian, who is the Managing Director of Middle East at Manufacturing Transformation Group, actually is the holding company that owns CMC. And Clive Greenwood, partner at WWMG Associates, based in Suzhou, next to Shanghai in China. Thank you so much to both of you, and to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode full of great advice. And I will talk to you next week again for the next episode. Thank you so much.